So, welcome to episode 3. In this episode, we're going to talk a lot more about the GST, where it came from, where it is today, and what reforming the GST might look like going forward. Again, I've got Alex with me. So, Alex, let's start off perhaps by talking a little bit about the history of the GST, when it came into place, what it replaced, and how did we get to the GST becoming that really important piece of tax reform that we saw in 2000 or in the late 90s.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Venkat. So prior to GST, we did have an equivalent of GST, but we called it sales tax. And the only thing with sales tax prior to 2000 was it would only apply to goods. Because when you look at GST today, it's goods and services. And we didn't have one rate. We had a whole multitude of rates from 0 through to about 21%. So it was a more difficult tax to implement. So because of that and the complexities about it, the government said back in early 2000, they wanted to bring in ANTS. And ANTS is just a new tax system. But if you think about ANTS, they irritate you, and that's what this new tax really did. And when you look at the new tax system, it said, okay, let's not just tax goods, but let's extend it and we'll tax services as well. That's why we called it the goods and services tax. And it's really a regressive consumption tax. Because we all consume, we consume goods, we consume services. So now we said, okay, if you consume, you want it, you pay for it. So it's like a user pay system, right? But we call it regressive primarily because it's got no reflection on your ability to pay. It's more about you want it, you pay for it. Whereas if you look at income tax, theory's always been the more you earn, the more you pay. Whereas the less you earn, you still pay the same as somebody that's a multi-millionaire. And that's one of the sort of how can I call it, disadvantages of GST. And that's why it's complicated, because we try to create exemptions or tax-free services to try to compensate people for it. So that's why, it sounds simple in context and it's broad approach, but when you actually implement it, it becomes a lot more difficult. So that's really the background. And we've had the same rate for the last 26 years. We haven't moved the rate.
That's right.
You look at other countries, they have increased the rates as a way to say, well, we want to get more tax, if you like, extract more money, but we don't want to raise your income tax. So let's always tax consumption, and that's the way a lot of countries go about it. Australia's always stuck it at 10% or 0. And that's basically one of our problems.
Yeah, and I guess the thing about that being a regressive tax, the flip side of that, meaning the advantage of that, is that a person who is a multimillionaire, for example, who might be able to structure their tax fees in a way so that they pay less tax, will find it very difficult to avoid the GST when they go to buy an expensive item. So I think in a way that's always been the sort of the other edge of the blade, if you like, which is that it is actually an effective tax in terms of being able to extract from those who do actually have higher consumption. But absolutely, I mean, it does mean that, if a person earning $1 million goes and buys a loaf of bread, they pay the same tax as someone who's on $30,000 a year. So that's the regressive element of it. And that's always been one of the big drawbacks. But as we were talking before we started the recording, Alex, the income tax rates did change as well at the time that the GST came in. And the idea was, as you said, you pay for what you want, so you'll pay tax. But also there was more money in your pocket because of lower income taxes. And I guess going forward from the point of view of thinking about how this might change in the future, people are always reluctant to pay more. But I remember when we had to go get this, we had to get part of an engine changed in our car, right? And it was a $2,000 bill. But because I handed it in before the GST came in and we picked it up in July, it suddenly cost me $200 more. And that was a pretty big hit, you see. So it's not the first time, really, that we've all had to pay more than what we used to for stuff that, we all need and need to have.
That's right. And I think the one of the downsides of GST is that when they first introduced it, there was this theoretical view, this will catch the cash economy. But it really doesn't, because people will want things done for their own private personal use. You do things to your house, you paint it, you repair it. And if you
It's
get those
probably encouraged the cash economy.
yeah, that's right. You get the service people say, yeah, I've got to charge you GST because I'm running a business. And you typically say, well, how much for cash?
Yeah, yeah,
And so you can
exactly.
people still want cash and do things in cash. And probably that's one of the reasons why the government's moving to a cashless society, so to speak. That is
Yeah,
attracting through, that's
correct,
so you
correct.
open one door, but then they slam another 20 in your face, so to speak. So
That's it.
but it doesn't stop people trying to be creative. And that's one of the things that Australians like to be with tax. Be creative.
But I think that happens anywhere, right? I mean, you put a
Yeah,
rule in front
yeah,
of someone, and,
yeah, yeah.
the average Joe is always going to try and find a way around the rules.
Correct,
So,
correct.
so I
Yeah,
don't think
yeah.
that's something that is going to change anytime soon.
No,
Just very quickly though, because when we talk about GST, it's also worth talking about what's included, what's excluded, right?
correct. Yes.
And very briefly, just explain the things that are excluded from GST,
Right.
just
So
the
when
main
we look at
categories.
so when we look at GST, we basically have three main sort of what we call supplies. And supplies are goods or services, and we call them taxable supplies.
Yep.
Then we call them GST free, and then we call them input tax supplies. And when you look at GST free, it's things that most people want. So that's like medical supplies. Now, when we talk about medical supplies, when you go to the doctors, you go to the chemist, etc. But the only thing that's not GST free with medical is if you get your bum lifted up or you get fat sucked out, where it's cosmetic.
Yep. If it's cosmetic, yes,
But
that's right.
if it's an illness or an injury, then yes, you get covered. So I think that will always stay. Then we've got certain foods like fresh food,
Yep.
fruit and vegetables. So they're always GST free or GST exempt. So those things are critical to people. So you've got, fundamentally you've got food, you've got
Yep.
medical services, okay, and then you've got overseas travel, you've got
Yep.
education,
Yes.
and so that's like your, school fees, etc. So
And some religious services are also exempt, aren't they? So,
yeah,
but
that's
we'll
right.
leave
So
that
there's
aside for the time
certain
being.
things that are politically, I guess, the government said we can't tax them with this extra tax. We've got to make them free. But the trouble is, when you make them free, you create exceptions, and the people try to come within exceptions or not. And it makes it, therefore you have a smaller pool on which to collect the 10%. So if you have a smaller pool, you should therefore think about raising the rate over time to get more money from GST. But you've got to compensate people if we raise by reducing our income tax rates, because we've got to have money after tax to pay for these things. And that's why we've got to have a balance between the two. Yeah.
Which is why this thing about exemptions is relevant, right? Because it actually determines the base from which you can collect GST. And I think, interestingly, I think I personally would be very reluctant to have the base expanded to things like food, for instance, because as it is, with increasing cost of living for everything, you would not really want to increase the cost of basic food consumption, right? Because that's actually quite a big impact. But there might be other areas that possibly should be considered for inclusion into the GST system that are currently excluded. But again, that's always more controversial, I think, than actually increasing the rate.
Well, I think when you look at the exclusions, we keep the exemptions, which is basically food and medical, but are two key drivers in education. But then we've got the third category, which we call input tax supplies. So input tax supplies just basically means you don't charge GST and you can't claim back the GST.
That's right.
So, on maybe some things you can say, well, that's okay. And that's like financial supplies. Okay, so you go to the bank, you get a loan, you put a term deposit. They don't charge you GST. They don't collect GST. Residential rent.
That's right.
Okay.
That's the other one.
You don't charge GST on the tenant. Okay, but all you do is up the rent. You're going to charge them anyhow. So
yeah, exactly.
You say it on the way and don't charge GST. Well, just increase the rent accordingly. If the tenant can't afford it, kick them out, find another tenant, so to speak. So you have all these,
which is what would happen anyway.
Yeah, correct. So you've got all these three different categories, and it's sometimes in theory it's hard to work out which one it actually fits into. And I think tax law is never going to be simple. It's never going to be efficient. It's never going to be fair. All right. So so if we try to streamline it, in some countries tell you have no exemptions.
Yeah, just whack it on everything and keep it.
And you lower the tax. So if you look at Singapore, their tax was 7, went to 8, down 9, only up to 9. All right? But they have a broader base on which to collect. So, you can have a broader base, but a lower tax to collect the same as with a higher base and exemptions, but make
Yeah.
life simple for everybody. Yeah.
It would make life simpler, but I think again the difficulty would be selling that, right? Because when we've been used to something, I mean, the argument that the Democrats put when John Howard was trying to get the GST passed in the upper house at the time, they basically said, well, these are sort of, given that we're supposedly a first world country, that access to food education and medical should be outside, should be basically public good, and that there should be an element of tax. So I think that's something that in Australia I think we'll find very difficult to sell. But look, the idea of increasing the rate of the GST is not new. Treasurers have been talking about this over the last 26 years. Most of them quickly lose their jobs when they start talking about increasing the GST, don't they?
But it's funny because you look across the ditch and they've increased it from 10 to 12 to 15 to 17.
I think so.
And they can do it. And I think, sometimes they've got to have a bit of balls and just do it. If they can sell it on the basis it's going to benefit all of us rather than just it's a tax hike.
And I think those are the two elements that are missing here, Alex. In the Australian debate, I think those are the two elements missing. One is we're not talking about increasing the rate, for example, slowly. We're not talking. Why not just put it up by 0.5%, right, a year, and eventually get to 15? It takes a while, but you're still getting to where you want to get to. That's one thing we're not talking about. And the second thing is nobody is doing a convincing job of selling to the public that if there's more GST revenue and there's less income tax, that overall the benefit to you is greater. And I think one of the things that they perhaps should do, right? I mean, we have a thing called a Medicare levy, right? So we have a 2% that funds the healthcare system. Now, anyone who's been to a public hospital knows the benefit of that because, especially if you had to go to emergency or something, you go in, you get treated, you walk out. Probably the only thing you're going to pay for is the car parking, right? Or the trip home on a taxi. The rest is all covered. So it's a pretty easy sell to say to people, pay the Medicare levy because people know that when the time comes and they need that support, it's there. But in the same way, we just need politicians to be clever about explaining that if the GST goes up, your income tax comes down, you got more in your pocket, right? But also they need to show that they're using that money to put back into essential services.
Correct. Well, I think taking your point, if you look at the Medicare, it started at 0.5%, then it went to 1%, then at 1.5% went to 2%. But each increment was really saying, okay, when we did the 1.5 to 2, we'd say we need to fund the NDIS.
Yeah.
So we set a specific purpose for it, and you can do exactly the same with GST. It goes 10.5. Okay, that extras to fund bloody petrol or whatever it may be, or cost of living, whatever.
Childcare or whatever it might be, which is actually an easy sell to the public when you think about it.
That's right. And, rather than wasting it on these idiots, you think, well, okay, if you raise it and specifically say that this increment is for the betterment of people in society, people are happy generally to pay that extra if they see it going somewhere not being wasted.
Well, exactly. And if they can
waste it, not us.
And if they can see it coming back to them as well in some way, right? Because ultimately the point of tax is we're paying for not just sort of a personal gain. It's not because I get something. It's because a group of people get something. So whether it's whether it's sort of young people between 18 and 24 years of age, or whether it's pensioners or whatever it might be, it's about, I think, communicate rather than just saying, oh, it's a 3-year cycle. Let's just think about getting re-elected for the next 3 years, and then we'll just sit around and just let it sort of flow.
And then later on become somebody else's problem. Who cares?
Well, that's it, right? And there's a lot of talk that this budget coming up in May is going to be, a bit of a game changer. But I wouldn't hold my breath. I think what we've seen is they always say, "Oh, there's going to be big stuff coming up," and then really it fizzles out into a nothing most of the time.
If they do announce big stuff, so they'll defer it till some time later. So rather than say, "Look, this is not the right time to raise taxes," whatever.
That's right. So, and then they'll use the excuse of, we'll let the electorate decide, rather than saying, no, we're going to do it. And I'm sure you remember this better than I do, Alex, but, back in the 80s, in the mid-80s especially, when we had some pretty significant tax reform, they just went ahead and did it. I mean, the government did have a mandate during the election, but You go in and then you do your job. You don't sit back and say, well, we'll let the next election decide the outcome, right?
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing about GST too is that if you look at OECD countries, Australia has actually got one of the lowest rates of GST, but also the amount of money we collect from GST. We talked about this in one of our previous videos, but the amount of money we collect from GST relative to income tax is really quite staggeringly low across other similar countries. And you mentioned New Zealand, you mentioned Singapore. But certainly there's lessons to be learned from there, right? That the way to go really is to increase taxes such as the GST and reduce income taxes. And overall, you end up collecting more.
Correct. Because I think you take the view with income tax, if the rate of income tax itself decreases, you say, well, okay, if I earn more, not just through wage rises or bracket creep or whatever, but if I actually earn more through work, I pay a little bit, I pay less tax, but I now got more money. I can spend it on things, goods and services, which helps in theory the economy.
I'm spending,
I'm consuming.
Correct. And look, we're going more and more towards a cashless society too. So the thing is, it's not like if we suddenly put money back in people's pockets that they would avoid GST by paying cash for everything. And the reality is, you can't go to a JB Hi-Fi or a Harvey Norman and say, "Hey, mate, how about I just do your cash?" You can't, right? You have to pay the official amount. There's places where you can avoid.
You can try.
You can try, but it doesn't normally work, Alex. I don't know if there's any JB that you know where it works. You let me know. I'll go shopping there as well.
You never know until you ask.
I always ask for a price decrease, but I've never asked them to take the GST off it.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and just another example there of this tax rate increase or decrease, whichever way you want to look at it, is when we had the company tax rates, we didn't just go from 30% to 25%. We had 28.5%, 27.5%. So it's not there's precedence, isn't there, that you do this sort of thing in order to get to an endpoint. So I guess to wrap up this one, really. From my point of view, I think the problem here is not policy. The problem here is not that we don't have ideas. The problem here is not that we don't have the means to do it, nor do we lack the examples from other countries to do it. The problem here is just political will. And, the federal politicians in this 3-year cycle just simply not prepared to go past looking at the medium to long term. What do you reckon?
They just want to look after themselves. And I think, all those things like the Medicare where it staggers up, as long as they sold it on the basis we use it to fund NDIS and all these things in the hospital system, and you do the same with consumption tax.
Yeah,
right?
I think so.
They don't have. I think they just don't have a story to sell to convince people.
Correct, and they're also probably, in my opinion, just too scared of the electorate turning around saying we're not going to vote for you because we don't want to spend, while we blame the politicians. The electorate's also very short-term minded too. So
but I think it's easier to target groups. So you're a property investor, Venkat, I'll target you. You're working high income, I'll target you, but you're leveraging and all those. So I don't take all of Australia, I just target certain, how can I call it, better off groups. Because I'm aiming at, the traditional working class theory. But I think everybody has aspirations. Everybody wants to buy things, own things. So you're not really encouraging people to, put in the effort sometimes.
No, exactly. Well, we might see changes soon. I doubt very much. Correct.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Alex. And we might just leave this episode there.